Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused, frustrated, or doubting yourself, even though you knew you were right? You replay the words in your head, wondering how the discussion went so wrong so fast. You tried to explain calmly. You stayed respectful. You brought facts, and somehow you still lost control of the conversation. That's because when you're dealing with a narcissist, the goal was never understanding. It was never resolution. It was never fairness. And the moment you try to win, you've already stepped into their game. Today we're talking about why you can't win against a narcissist, and more importantly, how you can take back control of the conversation without arguing, defending, or losing yourself in the process. Trying to win an argument with a narcissist only feeds their need for control, and that's the part most people don't realize until they're already exhausted. You step into the conversation believing it's about facts, fairness, or being heard. You assume if you stay calm enough, explain clearly enough, or prove your point logically enough, the discussion will eventually land somewhere reasonable. But with a narcissist, the argument was never about the topic itself. It was about power from the very beginning. When you try to win, you unknowingly accept their rules. You agree to play on their field, under their timing, inside their version of reality. Every response becomes an invitation. Every explanation becomes leverage. Every emotional reaction becomes evidence, not of truth, but of influence. They don't listen to understand, they listen to regain dominance. That's why they interrupt, deflect, exaggerate, and shift the topic the moment the conversation starts moving away from their control. Winning to them doesn't mean being correct. It means keeping you engaged. It means pulling your attention back whenever you start to detach. The longer you argue, the more successful they feel. Even when they're losing logically, they're winning emotionally because you're still there, still reacting, still trying. This is why conversations with narcissists feel circular. You answer one accusation and suddenly there are 5 more. You clarify a misunderstanding and somehow that clarification becomes another attack point. You think progress is being made, but the goalposts keep moving. That confusion isn't accidental. It's strategic. Confusion keeps you off balance, and imbalance keeps them in charge. The mistake many people make is assuming that reason will override manipulation. But manipulation doesn't collapse under logic. It adapts. When facts don't work, they use emotion. When emotion doesn't work, they use guilt. When guilt fails, they use silence, sarcasm, or outrage. The argument becomes a maze designed to keep you searching for an exit that doesn't exist. Trying to win also signals something dangerous, that their opinion has authority over your peace. It tells them that if they push hard enough, you'll keep showing up to defend yourself, and defense is powerful fuel. The more you justify, the more they sense vulnerability. The more you explain, the more they learn which buttons still work. That's why winning never brings relief. Even if you prove your point, the tension remains. The argument resurfaces later. The narrative quietly changes. The story gets rewritten. What you thought was resolution turns into another chapter of control. A narcissist doesn't want closure. Closure ends influence. They want continuation. They want the conversation to linger in your head long after it ends, replaying what you should have said, questioning your tone, doubting your memory. The moment you realize this, everything shifts. You stop measuring success by agreement. You stop chasing validation from someone who withholds it on purpose. You recognize that winning isn't convincing them of your truth. Winning is refusing to sacrifice your stability for their satisfaction. Because every attempt to defeat a narcissist in conversation strengthens exactly what you're trying to escape. It reinforces their sense of importance. It feeds their appetite for reaction. It keeps you emotionally available in a dynamic that was never designed to be fair. And the hardest truth is this: the argument continues only as long as you keep trying to win it. Narcissists don't seek truth, they seek dominance. And that distinction changes everything about how their conversations operate. Most people enter discussions assuming there is a shared objective to understand, clarify, or solve something. With a narcissist, that shared objective does not exist. The conversation is not a bridge between two perspectives, it is a stage. And on that stage, they must remain superior. Truth requires openness. It requires the ability to be wrong, to adjust, to listen. Dominance requires none of those things. Dominance only requires control of the emotional direction. That's why facts rarely matter to a narcissist. Evidence doesn't persuade them. Consistency doesn't stabilize them. Even their own previous words can be denied without hesitation if admitting them would weaken their position. When you present the truth, they don't experience it as information. They experience it as a threat. A different perspective challenges their sense of authority, and authority is something they defend at all costs. So instead of engaging with what you said, they focus on how it made them feel, how it sounded, or how it can be reframed to put them back on top. This is why conversations with narcissists often feel upside down. You're discussing behavior, and suddenly you're accused of attitude. You're addressing a problem, and now you're being told you're the problem. The topic is never allowed to remain on neutral ground because neutrality doesn't benefit dominance. A narcissist will twist truth not because they're confused, but because distortion maintains power. They may exaggerate small details, ignore context, or reinterpret events entirely. Not to clarify, but to reposition themselves as the authority in the room. The narrative must orbit them. If it doesn't, it gets rewritten. That rewriting can be subtle. They might say, "That's not what happened," even when it clearly is. Or, "You're remembering it wrong," even when multiple facts align. Over time, this chips away at your confidence because truth loses stability when someone refuses to acknowledge it. You start questioning not just the conversation, but yourself. Dominance also explains why narcissists escalate so quickly. Calm disagreement feels like disrespect to them. Boundaries feel like defiance. Silence feels like rebellion. Anything that limits their influence is interpreted as a personal attack, so they respond with intensity rather than reflection. They may raise their voice, mock, interrupt, or accuse, not because the issue warrants it, but because emotional volume creates authority. If they can overwhelm the conversation, they can steer it. Chaos becomes a tool. The louder or more dramatic the moment, the less room there is for logic. This is also why they struggle deeply with accountability. Accountability places everyone on equal ground, and equality feels intolerable. Admitting fault would mean surrendering the upper position, even briefly. So responsibility is redirected, minimized, or buried under excuses. You may notice that even when they apologize, it's rarely about the behavior itself, it's about how you reacted to it. The focus subtly returns to you because dominance must be preserved even in moments that appear humble. Once you understand that dominance is the goal, not truth, their behavior becomes predictable. You stop being surprised when honesty doesn't land. You stop expecting consistency. You stop waiting for acknowledgement that never comes, because in their world, the truth is not something to discover, it's something to control. Explaining yourself gives them power over the conversation, even though it feels like the most reasonable thing to do in the moment. When someone misunderstands you or accuses you unfairly, the instinct is immediate and human: clarify, justify, correct. You want the record straight. You want to be seen accurately. But with a narcissist, explanation doesn't resolve misunderstanding, it creates opportunity. The moment you begin explaining, you shift the balance. You move from equal participant to respondent. Now you're reacting to their framing instead of standing in your own. They've set the agenda and you're following it sentence by sentence. Every explanation you offer becomes raw material they can reshape, interrupt, or twist to fit their narrative. They listen to explanations differently than most people. They're not absorbing meaning, they're scanning for leverage. A word choice, a pause, an emotional note in your voice, any of it can be extracted and used later. What you intended as clarity becomes ammunition. What you hoped would calm the situation becomes something they can challenge, mock, or reinterpret. Explaining also signals something subtle but powerful, that their judgment matters enough for you to defend yourself against it. To a narcissist, that's confirmation of influence. It tells them they've struck a nerve, that their accusation landed, that they're steering the emotional direction of the exchange. This is why explanations never seem to be enough. You clarify one point, and suddenly there's another demand for justification. You explain again, more carefully this time, and now the issue isn't what you did, but how you said it. The standard keeps shifting because the explanation itself is the reward. As long as you keep providing it, they stay in control. Over time, this dynamic becomes exhausting. You find yourself overthinking before conversations even begin. You rehearse responses in your head. You add disclaimers, soften your words, anticipate misinterpretations. Not because you're unclear, but because you've learned that anything you say can be turned against you. Explaining also keeps you emotionally engaged in a system designed to drain you. It pulls you deeper into their version of the conversation, where you're constantly on defense. And defense is a weak position, not because you're wrong, but because it forces you to respond rather than choose. What makes this especially difficult is that explanation works with reasonable people. In healthy conversations, clarity builds understanding. With a narcissist, clarity threatens control. So instead of reducing tension, your explanations increase it. They may interrupt before you finish. They may accuse you of talking too much. They may say you're over-explaining, even as they demand more details. The contradiction is intentional. It keeps you off balance, questioning how much is too much and whether you've said the wrong thing again. Eventually, explaining becomes a habit. You justify feelings, you justify boundaries, you justify needs, and the more you justify, the more those things appear negotiable. Your reality starts to feel like something that needs approval. The power shift happens not when you explain better, but when you stop explaining at all, when you state instead of justify, when you respond without elaborating, when you recognize that clarity is not the same as compliance. Because every explanation you offer to someone committed to control strengthens the very grip you're trying to escape. Emotional reactions become their advantage, and this is one of the most effective tools a narcissist uses in conversation. They study emotion the way others study language. Not to connect, but to control. Your tone, your facial expression, your frustration, even your silence gives them information about where your limits are and how to push past them. When you react emotionally, the conversation stops being about the issue and starts being about your response. The focus quietly shifts away from what was said or done and onto how you reacted to it. Anger becomes evidence against you. Tears become proof you're unstable. Defensiveness becomes confirmation that you're guilty. The original concern disappears, replaced by an analysis of your emotions. This is why narcissists provoke. The sarcasm, the dismissive comments, the subtle insults, the sudden accusations are rarely accidental. They are pressure points designed to trigger a reaction. Once emotion enters the conversation, they gain the upper hand because emotion can always be discredited. A calm voice threatens their control. A reactive one restores it. The moment you raise your voice, they can say you're overreacting. The moment you cry, they can accuse you of being dramatic. The moment you show frustration, they can label you as difficult. No matter which emotion appears, it becomes a distraction they can exploit. What makes this tactic especially powerful is that your reaction often feels justified. Anyone would feel upset being misrepresented or blamed unfairly. But justification doesn't protect you here. The narcissist isn't judging fairness, they're harvesting emotion. Once they sense emotional charge, they escalate. They may repeat the same statement again and again. They may deny obvious facts. They may mock your feelings or pretend confusion. Each move is designed to increase intensity until your reaction becomes the headline. Then they point to it and say, "This is the problem." Meanwhile, their behavior fades into the background. Emotional reactions also feed their sense of importance. Strong reactions communicate that their words have power, that they can affect your mood, your stability, your peace. Even negative attention confirms relevance, and relevance is what they crave. This is why walking away emotionally feels threatening to them. When you stop reacting, they lose feedback. When your tone stays flat, they lose momentum. When your answers shorten, their influence weakens. They may accuse you of being cold or uncaring when this happens. That accusation is not about connection. It's about lost access. Emotional neutrality removes the reward system they depend on. Without reactions, their provocations fall flat. The conversation stalls because they can no longer steer it through intensity. This doesn't mean suppressing emotion or denying how you feel. It means choosing not to process those emotions in front of someone who uses them as currency. You can feel anger without displaying it. You can feel hurt without explaining it. You can feel frustrated without defending it. Control returns the moment your emotions stop being available for manipulation. When your calm becomes consistent, their chaos loses effect. Because in conversations with a narcissist, emotion isn't a weakness, exposure is. Boundaries matter more than logic, especially when you're dealing with someone who isn't interested in fairness or mutual understanding. Logic assumes shared values. It assumes both people are willing to listen, consider, and adjust. Boundaries assume nothing. They exist regardless of whether the other person agrees, understands, or approves. This is where many people get stuck. They keep trying to reason their way into respect. They believe if they explain clearly enough why something hurts, why it's unfair, or why it shouldn't happen, the other person will naturally stop. But narcissistic behavior doesn't respond to explanation. It responds to limits. Logic invites debate, boundaries end discussion. When you lead with logic, you open the door to argument. Every reason can be challenged. Every explanation can be questioned. Every feeling can be dismissed. A narcissist excels in debate because debate gives them room to twist meaning and reclaim dominance. A boundary, on the other hand, is not an argument. It's a decision. It doesn't ask for permission and doesn't require agreement. It simply states what you will or will not engage in. That difference is critical. When you say, "You're hurting me when you speak like that," a narcissist may mock your sensitivity, deny intent, or accuse you of exaggeration. When you say, "I'm not continuing this conversation if you speak to me that way," there's nothing to reinterpret. The focus moves from their behavior to your action. Boundaries shift power inward. They don't control the other person, they control you. And that's why they're effective. A narcissist may ignore logic, but they can't ignore consistent consequences. At first, boundaries often provoke pushback. You may be accused of being selfish, dramatic, disrespectful, or cold. This reaction is predictable. Boundaries threaten access, and loss of access feels like loss of control. That backlash often tricks people into retreating. They soften the boundary, they over-explain it, they apologize for it, and the moment they do, the boundary weakens. A boundary does not need defense. Defending it turns it back into logic, and logic reopens negotiation. Consistency is what gives a boundary weight, not tone, not wording, not emotional intensity, just repetition, calm repetition. You don't need to convince them your boundary is reasonable. You don't need to justify why it exists. You don't need them to agree that it's fair. Fairness is irrelevant to someone who benefits from imbalance. What matters is what you do when the boundary is crossed. If you say you will disengage, you disengage. If you say the conversation is over, you end it. If you say you'll leave the room, you leave. The action reinforces the line far more than any explanation ever could. Over time, this creates predictability. They learn what behavior grants access and what behavior removes it. Even if they dislike the boundary, they begin to recognize it. Boundaries also protect your energy. They reduce emotional exhaustion because you stop arguing for your right to exist comfortably. You no longer negotiate respect. You require it through behavior. Logic tries to change them. Boundaries preserve you. And preservation's power short. Calm responses shift control back to you because they interrupt the rhythm a narcissist depends on. Their communication style thrives on momentum. Long explanations, emotional storytelling, and rapid back and forth exchanges give them space to provoke, redirect, and dominate. When your responses become brief and steady, that momentum collapses. A narcissist expects engagement. They anticipate reactions layered with detail they can dissect or distort. When instead they receive a simple sentence, the power dynamic changes. There is nothing extra to argue with, nothing emotional to grab onto, nothing complex to twist. Length invites manipulation. Brevity limits it. Short responses prevent the conversation from expanding into chaos. They reduce opportunities for interruption and keep the exchange contained. When you speak less, they have fewer entry points. This is not avoidance. It is precision. Calmness plays an equally important role. Emotional neutrality removes urgency from the interaction. Narcissists rely on escalation. They push until the conversation feels intense because intensity creates confusion and confusion creates control. When your tone remains even, the escalation has nowhere to go. A calm response does not challenge them directly, and that's what makes it effective. It denies them the conflict they're trying to generate. You are not fighting back, but you are also not giving in. You are simply present without being reactive. Short, calm statements also reinforce boundaries without announcing them. Saying "I disagree" is more powerful than explaining why. Saying "that's not something I'm discussing" closes the loop without inviting negotiation. The fewer words you use, the less room there is for reinterpretation. This approach often feels uncomfortable at first because it goes against instinct. You may feel rude. You may feel dismissive. You may feel like you're not defending yourself enough, but what feels incomplete to you feels disorienting to them. They may push harder at first. They may repeat themselves. They may raise their voice or accuse you of not listening. This is an attempt to pull you back into over-explaining. Staying consistent is what matters. Short responses communicate self-trust. They signal that you don't need to persuade, justify, or convince. Your words are not a performance, they're a position. This changes the emotional temperature of the interaction. When one person stays regulated, the entire dynamic shifts. You become less predictable, less reactive, and therefore harder to manipulate. Calm brevity also protects your energy. You're no longer draining yourself trying to correct every distortion or defend every accusation. You choose what deserves a response and what doesn't. Over time, this creates distance without hostility. You are still present, but no longer accessible in the same way. The conversation becomes less dramatic because there's no emotional payoff. Control doesn't come from dominating the exchange. It comes from regulating your participation in it. When your words become fewer and your tone remains steady, the conversation begins to move at your pace instead of theirs. Silence can be stronger than persuasion, especially when you're dealing with someone who depends on reaction to feel in control. Most people underestimate silence because it feels passive. It feels like doing nothing. But in the presence of a narcissist, silence is not absence. It is resistance. Persuasion assumes the other person is open to influence. It assumes there is space for mutual understanding. With a narcissist, persuasion often becomes a trap. The more you try to convince, the more invested you become. You gather points, refine arguments, adjust your wording, all while the conversation quietly remains under their command. Silence removes that command. When you stop responding immediately, the dynamic changes. There is no emotional feedback, no confirmation that their words landed, no reassurance that they still have access to your attention. The space you create disrupts their sense of dominance. Narcissists rely heavily on immediacy. Quick replies signal urgency. Urgency signals importance. When you pause, you break the rhythm they expect. The delay forces uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for someone who depends on control. Silence also prevents escalation. Arguments grow because each response fuels the next. A pause interrupts the chain reaction. Without your contribution, the tension has nowhere to build. This doesn't mean ignoring everything or withdrawing completely. It means choosing when not to engage. Not every statement deserves a response. Not every accusation requires correction. Not every provocation needs acknowledgement. Silence is a filter. It protects you from reacting impulsively. It allows emotion to pass before words are spoken. It gives you time to decide whether engagement serves you or simply serves the pattern. For a narcissist, silence often feels threatening. They may accuse you of stonewalling, being cold, or avoiding accountability. These accusations are rarely about communication. They are about lost influence. When your silence is calm and intentional, it communicates stability. You are not confused. You are not overwhelmed. You are choosing not to participate. Silence also prevents narrative distortion. The less you say, the less can be twisted. Without explanations, justifications, or emotional commentary, there is little material to manipulate. In many cases, silence exposes behavior more clearly than words ever could. When you stop engaging, their tactics become more visible. The provocations increase. The tone sharpens. The control attempts surface without disguise. You are no longer part of the illusion of dialogue. Silence can also reset your internal focus. Instead of monitoring their reactions, you return attention to your own state. Your breathing slows, your thoughts clear. The conversation stops living rent-free in your mind. Persuasion drains energy because it depends on outcome. Silence conserves energy because it requires none. It does not seek agreement. It does not chase validation. It does not beg for understanding. It simply holds space, and in that space, control begins to shift. You don't need validation from someone committed to misunderstanding you, and this realization is often the hardest part of breaking free from a narcissistic dynamic. Validation feels essential because it's how healthy relationships function. Being seen, acknowledged, and understood reassures us that our experience matters. So when someone consistently denies that understanding, the natural response is to try harder to earn it. With a narcissist, that effort becomes endless. They misunderstand not because they can't understand, but because understanding would remove their advantage. Recognition would require empathy. Empathy would require equality, and equality threatens the position they rely on to feel secure. So instead of meeting you where you are, they shift the lens. They hear your words, but reinterpret your intent. They focus on tone instead of meaning. They reduce your experience to exaggeration or sensitivity. Each response subtly moves the conversation away from your reality and toward their control. This creates a painful loop. You explain yourself, hoping clarity will finally land. You adjust your language, soften your emotions, add context, but the validation never comes. Not because you failed to communicate, but because the outcome was never available. The more you seek their understanding, the more authority you hand them over your self-worth. You begin measuring your truth by their response. When they dismiss you, doubt grows. When they mock you, shame creeps in. When they deny your experience, you question your own perception. This is how internal erosion begins, not through loud attacks, but through quiet invalidation. Releasing the need for their validation is not about becoming detached or indifferent. It's about relocating authority. You stop outsourcing your sense of reality to someone who benefits from distorting it. You begin to recognize that being misunderstood by someone unwilling to understand does not make you unclear. It makes the dynamic unhealthy. Validation from a narcissist is conditional. It appears briefly when it serves them and disappears the moment it doesn't. Chasing it keeps you emotionally dependent on an unstable source. When you stop needing them to agree, something powerful happens. Their words lose weight. Their reactions lose urgency. The conversation no longer defines your sense of self. You can acknowledge disagreement without internal collapse. You can hear criticism without absorbing it. You can walk away without rehearsing explanations in your head. This shift is quiet but profound. You no longer enter conversations to prove your goodness, your intention, or your worth. You enter knowing those things already exist, regardless of how they respond. Letting go of validation does not mean accepting mistreatment. It means refusing to let someone else decide whether your experience counts. You begin validating yourself through consistency, values, and boundaries rather than approval. Your confidence stops fluctuating with their mood. When misunderstanding is intentional, clarity will never fix it, but self-trust will. And once you no longer require their recognition to stand firmly in your truth, the conversation loses its power to destabilize you. When you understand that you cannot win against a narcissist, the pressure to argue disappears. You stop trying to outthink, outtalk, or outlast someone who was never playing fair. The struggle was never about intelligence or communication skill. It was about control. The moment you see that, everything changes. You realize that winning was never the goal. Peace was. Control of the conversation doesn't come from proving your point. It comes from choosing how much access someone has to your time, your energy, and your emotions. It comes from recognizing manipulation without needing to expose it. From staying grounded when chaos is offered. From responding intentionally instead of reactively. You stop chasing understanding from someone who uses confusion as a weapon. You stop explaining yourself to someone who listens only to dominate. You stop feeding behavior that grows stronger on attention. Instead, you speak less, you pause more, you hold boundaries without apology, you protect your calm like something valuable. And slowly, the power dynamic shifts. Not because they changed, but because you did. You don't need to defeat them to reclaim yourself. You don't need the last word. You don't need closure they'll never give. You only need clarity about who you are and what you will no longer participate in. Because when you control the conversation, you control your peace. And that is the only win that ever mattered.